Grosse Pointe Historical Society's first Dr. Frank Bicknell Lecture of the 2021 season. As a result of the pandemic, we're all participating in the first online Bicknell Lecture, and we really appreciate your attendance. This lecture series is named in honor of Dr. Frank Bicknell. We can put up that picture at him. His daughter and son-in-law created the Dr. Frank Bicknell Trust Fund to mark Dr. Bicknell's 80th birthday in 1987. By the way, Dr. Bicknell was a well-known urologist in the Detroit Medical Center. Dr. Bicknell attended these programs until his passing in 1999. I'm Mike Skinner, chairperson of the Society's Bicknell Committee. The other committee members are Adam Hellebuck and Susan Lewandowski. Adam is this evening's moderator, handling all the technical issues relating to the online program. Meanwhile, the fact that we are meeting remotely has made it impossible for Susan to bring cookies and refreshments for those to enjoy, as she always has done in the past.
Yeah, big responsibility.
We look forward to returning to an in-person program when we reach the new normal, hopefully sometime in 2021. The Society's 3 fall 2020 lectures are actually the programs that were scheduled for March, April, and May, after the pandemic made it impossible to hold in-person programs. In order to accommodate 2 of the presenters and in order to mark the centennial of women's suffrage as close as possible to the actual date in August of the centennial, this program, the programs for March, April, and May were reversed. This first remote program was rescheduled from May. As many of you know, each May during Preservation Month, the Society has had the honor of working with Grosse Pointe, the Grosse Pointe community's greatest example of historic preservation, the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. We were all fortunate that when Mrs. Eleanor Clay Ford died in 1976, as the Free Press noted, quote, Mrs. Ford's greatest gift to the public, indeed her greatest legacy, is her home, which she has transferred to a trust with a request that it be used for the benefit of the public, unquote. With this final act of generosity, Mrs. Ford, which Mrs. Ford included in her will, the home and the furnishings remained intact as a window to the past, Grosse Pointe's past. But today we're equally proud as we commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage in the United States, that the program is also being jointly sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Grosse Pointe. Meanwhile, we hope that you will consider donating to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society Capital Campaign as the Society raises funds to build its new administration and collections resource building across this Kirchville from its 1823 Provençal Warehouse Museum. And of course, here you see the architectural drawing of this building. Before I describe the October and November lectures and introduce the evening speaker, I'd like to introduce representatives from the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House and the League of Women Voters of Grosse Pointe. It is a pleasure to introduce Mark Heppner, president of the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Great honor bringing you. I really wish we could be at our new facilities, which you're seeing some aerial right now of the new visitor center and the new administration building that we're so proud of. It seems like it's taken forever, and COVID certainly has not helped it. But soon enough, I promise you, we will be hosting you in a lovely lakeshore room that overlooks Ford's Cove and one of the best views in our area. And so we're really excited to be bringing that to the community. You know, Ford House has been supporting this program for a long time, and we're so proud of doing that. And I could not be more happy about the subject matter tonight as well. Many of you don't know, actually Ford House in years past has served as a polling station for elections. And when we had to close down for COVID and for construction, we weren't able to do that, but we look forward to actually reopening as a polling station. And even our own staff, you know, we're very dedicated to all our rights for in celebrating our civil liberties of voting. And we actually have just passed a new little employee benefit, not even a benefit, but a policy where we are giving our staff on local, state, and federal election days up to 4 hours of paid time off to vote and or volunteer to be active and to be out there. So again, this is a great subject matter. We look forward to having you at Ford House. So much is going on there. Right now we're closed to the historic buildings, but you could come and tour the property. It's a great excuse just to get out of doors in a very, very safe environment. So go online and look at that. We also have fantastic educational programming. This is not to take away from the Grosse Pointe Historical Societies, whose programs are top notch. But we too, if you go on our website, our staff has been very, very flexible and adaptive and put a lot of our program virtually and online, and I'm just so proud of them and what we're doing today. So again, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you to the Historical Society. Susan, thank you for your time tonight, and we really, really look forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. Next, I have the honor of introducing Judy Florian, President of the League of Women Voters of Grosse Pointe. Judy?
Thank you, Mike. The League of Women Voters of Grosse Pointe is very pleased to serve as a co-sponsor this evening. The League of Women Voters was founded in 1920 to support the new women's suffrage rights. The organization was a merger of the National Council of Women Voters and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. This merger occurred approximately 6 months before the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Our local Grosse Pointe League was founded in February 1950 and has a very proud history, focusing on better local government. As part of our voter education efforts, the League actively works with our local clerks to recruit volunteers to help mail absentee ballots, as well as find poll workers for elections. Prior to COVID-19, we conducted in-person voter registration events at our local high schools and Wayne County Community College. With our new normal, we are finding virtual ways to continue to promote voter registration efforts. Our members actively participated in the 2019 Promote the Vote effort by circulating petitions and educating the community on the proposed legislation. This resulted in the passage of Proposal 3, which amended the state constitution to expand voting rights. The League of Women Voters hosts candidate forums for our local elections. We recently conducted virtual forums for the Grosse Pointe School Board candidates and the 32A District Judge of Harper Woods candidates. These forums were recorded and are uploaded to our own personal YouTube channel for the community to view. We even have voters living abroad who depend on our forums to educate themselves before marking their ballots. Each year, our league distributes 7,000 Your Government Officials brochures with contact information on all local, state, and federal governments. The League of Women Voters is an active league presenting programs on recycling, climate control, gerrymandering, and more. The photograph you see on the screen was created by our league, partnering with the American Association of University Women of Grosse Pointe and the Seroptimists of Grosse Pointe to recreate this suffrage moment. How appropriate that we could honor our foremothers who worked through the 1918 flu pandemic to get the vote over 100 years ago with this photograph during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 19th Amendment promised women that their right to vote would not be denied on the basis of sex. Yet even after that milestone, millions of people, minority women and men alike, were still excluded from the vote. The fight over the 19th Amendment was not just about sex, it was also deeply entangled with race. It wasn't until 45 years later that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, overcame legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans and Native American Indians from exercising their right to vote as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. The Voting Rights Act contains several provisions that regulate elections. One provision prohibits every state and local government from imposing any voting law that results in discrimination against racial or language minorities. Other general provisions specifically outlaw literacy tests and similar devices that were historically used to disenfranchise racial minorities. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. Unfortunately, this act is being under threat today based on several court decisions. I'm happy to announce that the Harper Woods Library has an excellent exhibit honoring the women's right to vote, outlining the struggles women faced 100 years ago to gain this right. I strongly encourage you to visit the library to view this exhibit. Grosse Pointe residents can get a library card for the Harper Woods Library since they share a school system. The Harper Woods Library is operating under reduced hours Monday through Wednesday from 11 to 7 and Thursday and Friday from 11 to 5. Now I'd like to turn it back to Mike, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you again to Mark and to Judy for both of you joining us this evening and for your organizations jointly sponsoring this program. Now, let me talk about the October and November programs before I introduce this evening's speaker. The October 21st program will feature the Arcadia Publishing History Press book, Early Organized Crime in Detroit, Vice, Corruption, and the Rise of the Mafia. This book explores Detroit and the metro area's struggle with gang violence, public corruption, and the politics of vice during the tumultuous first half of the 20th century. The presenter and author is Dr. James Bucelato, who has been a faculty member in the Department of Criminology and Crime Justice at Northern Arizona University and the Irwin D. Reed Honors College at Wayne State University. He researches and writes about the politics of crime, and his work has appeared in several peer-reviewed journals, crime anthologies, and national news websites. He's also a certified gang specialist with the National Gang Crime Research Center in Chicago, co-hosts a podcast called The Real Gangsters, and also appeared as an expert on organized crime and gangs in documentary episodes featured on Vice Television and the Travel Channel. A native Detroiter, he's been fascinated by his family's history in Sicily and in Detroit since he was a child. Then our November 18th program will feature the Arcadia Publishing History Press book, Wicked Women of Detroit. This program describes some of Detroit's most violent, clever, and misunderstood female criminals. And I will take the blame as the committee chair, but I want to assure you, everyone, that the inclusion of this program so close to the one related to women's suffrage was an unfortunate coincidence. Dr. Tobin Buck, B-U-H-K, describes himself, the author and presenter that night, as a connoisseur of crime, a gourmet of the ghastly, an aficionado of the atrocious, a fanatic of the felonious, and a maven of misdeeds. Sounds interesting. This is his 10th book, and he's been featured as an expert on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum. Finally, tonight's program, Votes for Women, Suffrage in Michigan. I'd like to note to everyone, at the bottom of the screen, there's a little Q&A button. You would click on that button and type in your question, and the questions will be read to the presenter at the end. We'll try not to run past 9 o'clock, so there'll be 15 minutes or so of questions at the end. As we commemorate the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, I should say that for more than 80 years, after Michigan became a state in 1837, women fought for the right to vote. Their goal was to overcome the obstacles that stood in their way and achieve the ultimate victory, suffrage for women in the United States. Michigan ratified the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution on June 10th, 1919, and it was officially adopted on August 26, 1920, after 2/3 of the states ratified it. It's an honor to introduce tonight's presenter. Sue Nenadic is a retired high school English and history teacher. She is the author of 2 books, the first being Purse of Her Own, Occupations of 19th Century Women, and the second being Legendary Locals of Ann Arbor, as well as having written many articles, including the May-June 2019 Michigan History Magazine of the same title as this evening's program. And here we see the cover page and the first page of that article. Ms. Nenadic provides programs throughout Michigan and teaches adult learning classes. She's a former board member of the Washtenaw County Historical Society, for which she was in charge of museum exhibits. She's currently a member of the Ann Arbor Street Exhibit Educational Committee, but most importantly, she's president of a nonprofit, Friends of Amaru, which is building and financing a school in rural Uganda. All of her speaking fees, I should note, are donated to this organization. Susan?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to the screen.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. There we go.
All right.
Can you see it?
Yep. Okay.
It's a pleasure to be here this evening from my home to yours. I couldn't help thinking about how much gasoline we were all saving. Anyway, we're going to have a look at the women's struggle for actually a little bit more than just voting, for equality, legal equality. And if the title baffles you right now, it will become clear later on. Oh God, it's not going forward. Guys.
Try to click the screen instead of use the arrows. Try that.
click the screen and use the arrows down here at the bottom.
Instead of the arrows, or the arrows.
Oh, okay, it
Perfect.
worked. Thank you. This is a brave new world we're all entering. All right. This is a young woman in about 1880. Her name is Annie Smith Peck. She looks like a pretty typical 19th century middle class girl, and but she wasn't ordinary at all. She actually got a master's and a degree, a bachelor's and then a master's at the U of M. Her master's was in 1881, and she taught Latin at Smith College, but her real passion was mountain climbing. And she climbed the second highest mountain in Peru, and she placed a banner at the top of the mountain that said, "A woman's place is at the top." Well, I don't know that women ever tried to be on the top, or I think equality is more what they were looking for. The only time women really had status was way about 40,000 years ago, when they worshiped the great mother goddess, which is represented by this very famous statue. Freud said that anatomy was destiny. And in some ways, I know people make fun of that, but it really is true. Back in the days of the hunting, gathering, and worshiping of the mother goddess, women could go hunt, but it's hard to take the baby with you when you go to hunt. And since the biological imperative is so important, I mean, it's just programmed in us, the men became the hunters. And that translated when we became a more settled people, that the men became the warriors after the hunters and became the warriors. And also they were able to farm with heavier equipment than the women could. And what was the end of all that? Well, it was women were second-class citizens, basically. And the only way they could gain status was through whoever they married. And I think this created the very first obstacle to women's freedom. And it created a lack of cohesion between women, because women identified with the husband's rank and not other women. Wealthy women didn't identify with poor women. Abolitionist women offended slaveholding women. Educated women might have looked down their noses at uneducated women. American women might resent immigrant women. Protestant women didn't see a connection with Catholic or Jewish women, and especially white women did not see a connection to African American, Indian, or Latino women. They had a lot of obstacles. This is only number 2. Lack of education was a huge problem for women in the 19th century. In 1820, Emma Willard started the Troy Academy in Troy, New York. It was the first academic high school for girls. And it just sort of changed the whole standard. By the way, it's still open as a boarding school. And in my locale, which I live in Ann Arbor, the Ypsilanti Seminary was the first high school that, co-ed high school that allowed girls. This is Abigail Rogers. Virtually nobody knows anything about her. We had to go to the basement to find this lovely portrait of her. She was the preceptress at Ypsilanti Seminary. Don't confuse it with like a religious seminary. It just meant school. And she was a preceptress, which was kind of like the assistant principal or the dean of women. She then became the preceptress at the normal school, which is now Eastern Michigan University. She tried very hard to get women into the U of M, but failed. And so she went to Lansing and opened up her own school called the Michigan Female College, all in her effort to get women better educated. And she received no governmental help with that project. The big turning point, I think, for women is when major schools like the U of M opened their doors to women. And the year was 1870. If you forget everything else, that's the thing to remember. And because it opened up the doors to lots of professions. I love this quote. When I was researching for the article, I read this book by Doris Weatherfield, and she said, Stanton created the lightning bolts, but Anthony threw them. Susan B. Anthony was not as well educated as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton went to Johnstown Academy. She studied math and languages. She won second in a Greek competition, and she was very skilled in debate. And in 1830, guess where she went to school? The Troy Academy of Emma Willard's. So she had all these children, so she kind of wrote the speeches, and then Susan B. Anthony gave them. The third obstacle, and this is a major one, I think, is that in the 19th century, there was a social prejudice against women speaking in public. Oberlin, I'm sure you've heard of it, but it's in Ohio, but it sort of set the standard because it was one of the first schools that opened all its doors to anyone. They didn't discriminate on the race, for race or religion or gender. Lucy Stone, who becomes a big, big person, you know, very influential person in the suffrage movement, she went to Oberlin, and she was valedictorian of the class. They told her that she could write the speech, but she was not allowed to give it. A man would read it. She declined to write it at all. Maya Angelou, by the way, did the same thing. She was told as a Black girl she could not deliver her address, and she also declined. Now, here are three of the famous names of three sort of different generations. And the thing that really hit me was how many of these women were Quakers. And I had to give that a lot of thought. Why would so many Quaker women be interested in this and good at it? Well, Quakers allowed women to speak in meeting. So they weren't totally without experience in that kind of activity. The first woman to give a speech, as far as I know, and I've looked into it, but anyway, was Angelina Grimke. And she spoke to the Massachusetts legislature in 1836. It was at the end of a speaking tour where she and her sister took throughout the New England area in their conviction that slavery was a wrong. The fourth obstacle is the lack of experience they had in forming and managing groups. There were a few groups before the Civil War in the East. I think it had to do with having an urban culture. When most of the country was lived far apart from your neighbors and were farmers, that kind of organization just didn't evolve very quickly. But right here in Michigan, we have two women who started the Logan Female Anti-Slavery Society so early, 1832. Miss Chandler died very young, but Laura Haviland had a long, long career as anti-slavery activist, Underground Railroad, and that sort of thing. Oh, by the way, her book is available in reprint, and it's worth reading. Story of My Life by Laura Haviland. This is a portrait you don't see very often of Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a younger woman. She met Lucretia Mott at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And what's really, I think, sort of amusing about it, she was on her honeymoon. And that's how she and her husband chose to spend their honeymoon. And that was the start of a link between these two incredible women who were going to be big names in this whole movement. the early meetings were of the abolitionist societies really offended Southern women. And they, as a result, they separated, and they weren't available to Northern women who began organizing. It's kind of interesting that the Grimke sisters do come from South Carolina, which is such a hotbed of conservatism, let's say. All right, so these things were moving along in the first half of the 19th century. And then there was this catalyst for change. And I don't think it will be a surprise to any of you to know that it was the Civil War. In the crucible of that devastating war, social prohibitions loosened. Women maintained family businesses and farms when their husbands were gone fighting or died. Women organized sanitation committees, which provided clothing and medicine for the fighting men. Women traveled alone. That was a big one. They traveled alone. They nursed men, strange men. They fought and died as soldiers, quite a few, in the thousands. And women functioned as spies. A few came very close to being hanged as spies. Women worked in offices and factories. In fact, munition factories, there was a huge disaster that killed 78 women who were in a munitions factory. So they were very, very active during that time. With emancipation achieved and the war over, women decided to go for their own goals, and they brought to it new skills and I think a new confidence in what they were doing. In 1866, just 1 year after the war, they organized the first National Women's Rights Convention. And you'll notice I have woman with the A-N in red. That's so I don't forget to tell you that that is the correct spelling. It wasn't women's, plural, rights. It was woman's rights. All right, but within 3 years, by 1869, Stanton and Anthony had formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, which allowed only female members. Lucy Stone formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, which allowed men to participate. Okay, you might not even know this woman. This is Isabella Beecher Hooker. She's from the famous Beecher family. Harriet Beecher Stowe was her sister. Catherine Beecher was her oldest sister. Anyway, she started the New England Woman Suffrage Association in the 1860s, and that morphed into the American Woman Suffrage Association. But she joined the National, where she used her financial resources and connections to arrange speakers from Congress, and even persuaded 5 senators to chair various suffrage conference sessions for the National Women's Suffrage Association in January of 1871. These two groups would not rejoin until 1890, so they lost 2 decades where they could have been working together. This frequent splitting apart and reorganizing, I think, is obstacle 5. Obstacle 6 is agreeing, identifying, and then prioritizing goals that everyone can agree to. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that the Seneca Falls Convention did not just talk about just about suffrage. After it was over, they wrote a sort of a takeoff on the Declaration of Independence that was called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was signed by 68 women and 32 men. So that meant 100 out of 300 signed it. I don't think it was shown to that many more because it was written, you know, without everybody's input, I guess is a nice way to say it. All right, but anyway, they focused on suffrage, yes, but also on women's rights to property, to their own income, to their children, and many, many other issues that were important to 19th century women. I'm sure you've all heard about Emily Bloomer. She was not, by the way, a very well-educated woman, though, even though she had a newspaper that she published urging people to give women the suffrage. Her most famous thing is that she designed this bloomer costume where the skirt was short and women wore these sort of full pants. I don't think that's her biggest or the most impact she had. Most people did not wear those outfits. But her biggest success in my book is that she introduced Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Susan B. Anthony. And the dynamic duo was born because those two were, you know, so very important to the whole movement. So after the Civil War, people started, the men in Congress started working on the 14th Amendment. And its basic thing is to identify who is a citizen of the United States. The 15th is the problem because it says that only male inhabitants of 21 years of age and citizens of the United States could vote. Therefore, Black men got to vote before women did. And many, many, I think decades ago, I predicted we'd have an African-American president, male, before we had a female president, and I guess I was right on that score. Michigan Senator Jacob Howard said he was not happy with the wording of the 14th Amendment. He called it half the loaf, but he would vote for it in any case, he said, because I think it is at present the best that can be obtained. Hence the title. Should women settle for what he called half the loaf? Well, they parted company over that issue too. The more practical ones said, well, half the loaf is better than nothing. And the more idealistic ones wanted, you know, if we don't have full voting rights, we haven't succeeded in what we're doing. Half the loaf in Michigan and in other states meant that women would settle for local elections, particularly school elections, instead of voting, equal voting rights on the national level. In 1874, the Michigan legislature bill for women's suffrage in municipal elections, so that's half the loaf, and even though it's half the loaf, it didn't pass. And it was the death knell for the Michigan State Suffrage Association. And for many years, there was no association in the state of Michigan. Another obstacle that held them back was deciding how to achieve these goals. Susan B. Anthony is pretty famous for having tested the voting rights laws in 1871. But right here, we have women in Michigan. Nanette Garner was a rich Detroit widow who moved to Ann Arbor. She went and they allowed her to vote. But Catherine Stebbins could not vote. And same thing happens, oh, no, sorry. The same thing happened in other places, and the difference between these two women is that Catherine Stebbins was married. Nanette Gardner at this time was not married, she was a widow. Which takes us to the law in the 19th century. It's called Femme Couverte, and it said that married women were not legal entities. When you married, your husband was supposed to represent you. You could not make contracts on your own, and many other legal sorts of things. Myra Bradwell, who passed the law test in the state of Illinois for the bar, she got a very high score, and the Illinois legislature would not give her a license to practice law. So she sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. The court, that was in 1869. It took them 5 years to get back to her, and they really dropped the ball. They dropped the ball also in the case of Minor versus Happersett. Mrs. Minor lived in Missouri, and she was denied the right to vote. And so she sued, and her case also went to the Supreme Court, and they dropped the ball on that one too. In both cases, they said that it was a state rights issue, and each state could do whatever they wanted. I wish I had a picture of this person. I tried so hard to get one, but I just can't find one. She, in 1888, sued the Flint, Michigan School Board for denying her right to vote in the local election. And the Michigan Supreme Court decision was in her favor. And so all the women in Michigan at least had half the loaf. Now, one of their strategies, was to merge with other reform groups in the hopes of getting more numbers into the process. And the first one they joined with, and it might seem like a no-brainer, I guess, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The problem was it backfired, because not only did it bring out all the brewers and the distillers who felt that if women could vote, they would vote for prohibition. It started some men's group working against a female suffrage. Okay, obstacle 8, dissolution due to frustration or lack of leadership. This is an obstacle, fortunately, that didn't happen. As we get to the later part of the 19th century and the very early 20th century, we see that the leaders that had been so devoted were starting to pass on. Fortunately, a whole new set of younger women came to the front. And some of them were like Harriet Stanton Blatch and Alice Stone Blackwell. Those were actually their mothers had been very, very active. Here's Alice Stone Blackwell. All right. Wait a minute. Sorry. Alice Stone Blackwell. Her big significance is that she got these two groups back together again. That it was very, very important. All right, and when they did rejoin, Carrie Chapman Catt became the president, and then Anna Howard Shaw succeeded her. Catt served from 1900 to 1904. Anna Howard Shaw served from 1904 to 1915. Shaw, by the way, is a Michigan woman. Her family settled in Big Rapids early in the 19th century. I think the important thing to remember about her is that she was one of the first women who entered the ministry, and she also was a doctor. But I think that Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president, she was apparently a very excellent speaker, which is one of those skills they really needed. All right. Okay, by 1900, when Catt became president of the National American Women's Association, many of the legal reforms had been gained. 40% of the university students were women, and over 100,000 women belonged to 500 women's clubs. So this obstacle of not knowing how to organize or not being educated, that had been overcome. Obstacle 9, this one did happen. The second generation had different goals and methods, and that weren't necessarily acceptable to everyone. This is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. You might be familiar with, I think the work of her that's most often read is the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, about the methodology of isolating women who didn't behave, who were, quotes, hysterical. Anyway, she also wrote, though, a very significant work called Women and Economics. It was published in 1898. And one of the other things that we started talking about was how the wealthy didn't necessarily mingle with, you know, even the middle class, let alone the lower working classes. This is Ava Belmont. She looks like a very spunky woman to me. Anyway, during the shirtwaist strike, she paid all the women on strike money so that they wouldn't starve while they were striking. And she underwrote a lot, used her money to underwrite a lot of suffrage publicity and expenses. And so that was, I think, about the first time that we got over that hump of, you know, the upper class not wanting to mingle with the rest of us. All right, so when Shaw was president, and she was president for a long time, she was unalterably opposed to militancy and was seen as outdated by the younger set of leaders who were, one of them was Harriet Stanton Blatch. And here she is, she's the baby with her mother. She was born in 1856. She married an Englishman and she lived abroad until 1902. She was the same age as Cat, but she was more in sympathy with the younger members who admired the aggressive tactics of the suffragettes in England. That would be Mrs. Pankhurst and her suffragettes. By the way, there's an excellent film by that title of Suffragette. I'd like to point out that suffragette is what the gals in England were called. In the United States, they were called suffragists. So the terms get kind of mingled sometimes in things you read. All right, so, okay, when she returned from England, Blatch joined the Women's Trade Union and the National American Women's Suffrage Unit, and she wrote this book, Mobilizing Woman Power. In 1907, she established the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women. That would, in a few years, morph into a new name of the Women's Political Union. I have to say that this little thing is harder to do than in person. Okay, Alice Paul was another huge leader at this time. She also was very well educated, as was Blatch, who received a math degree from Vassar in 1878. Alice Paul, another Quaker, was graduated from Swarthmore and received a master's and a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in economics. And she studied at Oxford, and in 1922 went on for a law degree. So she's very impressive academically. Lucy Burns, over on the right, is the third of that triumvirate. She studied at Vassar and Columbia. She met Alice Paul in England, where they became members of Mrs. Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union. I think that being abroad, living in England for all three of them was a really transformative period. Burns especially, I'm told, was an excellent speaker. Both of these two women would be arrested and jailed in England. So it was the militancy that these three found in England that inspired them when they returned to the US to reinvigorate the suffrage movement in their native land. One of the things Alice Paul, this was probably the biggest thing Alice Paul organized, was this incredible parade in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913. They had tableaus, they had, you know, all these floats, and thousands of women came to that, came to see it and came to participate. Now, I'm sure some of you know about Ida B. Wells. She was not, you know, a shrinking violet. She stood up for what she felt was right. And in this case, she had started in Chicago women's suffrage groups for African-American women. And when they got to the parade, and remember, this was one of the big obstacles, how are we going to get past this issue of race? And when she got to Washington, all of them, they were told that they could walk at the end of the parade. Well, she wasn't going to take that, at least for herself. She just sort of stood in the crowd, and when they went by at the beginning of the parade, she just jumped in with them and continued from there. But my favorite story, I think, is that Woodrow Wilson came to Washington by train for his inauguration. Oh, I'm sorry. And anyway, he expected a crowd to be at Union Station to meet him. And anyway, there was nobody there. And so he says to this man that was working, he says, "Where is everybody?" And they said, "Well, they're all at the suffrage parade." Well, that was a real introduction for old Wilson there. And of course, they organized these protests outside of the White House. And we're so used to that that we don't really even realize how really avant-garde that kind of behavior, especially for a woman. And they were put in jail, where they went on hunger strikes, some of them, and were forced fed. And the interesting thing to me about those tactics by the government is that it really backfired. A lot of people who had not been sympathetic, particularly to the cause, they became sympathetic because they thought these women were not being treated appropriately for a woman. Okay, so this is Alice Paul's Congressional Union, and it's split from the National American Woman Suffrage Association and became the National Woman's Party. I think I wanted to tell you, yes. Anyway, that was backed by Ava Belmont's big pocketbook, and 18 months later, it had 2 million women as members. So it was working. Okay. Meanwhile, here in Michigan, despite the backing of the governor, the amendment failed. Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, MESA it was called, cried fraud. And it turned out that when they collected the votes, and in some precincts had more votes than they actually had residents. So it was not an honest kind of thing. The Michigan Association opposed to women's suffrage claimed women were indifferent. So the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association collected 200,000 signatures of Michigan women who wanted to vote. Finally, in 1917, the governor signed the bill to allow women to vote in presidential elections. And on June 10th, 1919, Michigan joined Illinois and Wisconsin to be the first states to ratify the 19th Amendment. It took until August of 1920 for Tennessee, the final state, to ratify. This is one of these wonderful stories you stumble on. This woman was very young when she attended the 1848 Seneca Falls conference. And she was the only woman who was still alive when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Apparently she was too ill to actually go out and vote, but she was just very, very happy that this thing had come to fruition finally. It took almost her whole life. Let's go back to Annie Peck here, the mountain climber. There's a wonderful story about her too. She apparently was in New York City and she wanted to attend a suffrage rally and speech. And so she went to buy a ticket from this woman in the lobby. And the woman said, well, I really don't have any tickets left. And she said, none at all. And the woman said, well, we only have, the balcony. I don't know that you'd want to go up the stairs. And Annie Peck said, I think I can handle it. Apparently they didn't know she was a mountain climber. And Annie Peck reminded me of a poem that Gilman wrote, and I'd like to share at least part of it with you because it seems really appropriate to what we're talking about. It's called Obstacle. Perhaps it was my muse, I'm not sure. I was climbing up a mountain path with many things to do, important business of my own and other people's too, when I ran against a prejudice that quite cut off the view. My work was such that could not wait. My path quite clearly showed. My strength and time were limited. I carried quite a load. And there that hulking prejudice sat all across the road. So I spoke to him politely, for he was huge and high, and begged that he would move a bit and let me travel by. He smiled, but as for moving, he didn't even try. So before him, helpless, in an ecstasy of woe, the mountain mists were rising, the sun was sinking low, when a sudden inspiration came as sudden winds do blow. I took my hat, I took my stick, my load I settled fair. I approached that awful incubus with an absent-minded air, and I walked directly through him as if he wasn't there. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have questions. The end. Let's see.
Great, thank you, Susan. Wonderful. Great. Are there any questions?
Seven.
Am I missing questions? I don't see any.
Nope, I don't see any. We can also have them in the regular chat if you have any questions as well. Either way.
Anyone have a question? No?
Find that inconceivable. There must be something.
Did we, excuse me,
Yeah.
Susan, did we get a copy, or do we have a copy of the Declaration of
Sentiments?
Sentiments?
You can download one right off the internet. It's
Okay,
just,
I like to read that.
just Google it. Yeah,
Good, yeah.
yeah.
Very good. Okay, okay.
You can find almost everything.
No questions. I'm surprised. Okay. Great. I'll tell you what, Susan, we've got a little bit of time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Amoru?
Well, Amoru is the name of, it means a boulder, big rock, and it's the name of a village in Uganda. And gosh, I think more than 20 years ago, I took my family on a primate safari to Uganda. My older son speaks fluent chimpanzee, I always say, because he does actually get these things to respond to him. Anyway, our guide was just the most amazing man. And through him, I met his nephew. And the nephew was a very bright boy who was an orphan. And at that time in Uganda, there was no public secondary schooling. So he went, I put him through school. And before you give me any kudos, I want to tell you that for $750 a year, that kid went to boarding school 10 months out of the year. And it's you can still do wonders with a little money in a country like that. This young man recently got married, and he told everyone I was his mother. he thinks of me that way. I told him I don't look like his mother, but anyway, so his uncle has always, the man was our guide. He always wanted to start a school and up in the village. And so when he was here, Peter, the young man, had come to Michigan for graduate school. So when his uncle came, he said he really wanted to start a school. And what did I think he should know? And I said, I can't comment at all on Ugandan schools. So I went the next summer, and we visited schools, and we set up the school legally. And this gentleman who was our guide, he donated 14 acres of family property for the school. And when I returned to America, I started this nonprofit because that's what they need, money. And so we've been trying to raise money. Of course, with COVID, it's kind of put a damper on everything, I think. But you can Google, if you're interested, you can Google Friends of Amoru. We have a website, and or you can get my email from Mike, and you can ask me whatever you need about that. But we would love if you could see your way clear to send us a little donation. By the way, we have an anonymous donor who's matching all donations. So you send $25, it becomes $50.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We do have a question about the program itself.
Uh-huh.
Can you compare the women's protest parade or protest after the election in 2016? Actually, it was the day after inauguration in 2017, to the parade during the Wilson administration.
Well, I think that I don't think anybody, there was a parade in New York, but I don't think people had ever seen anything done at that scale that the parade in Washington was. And there's been many times in all of our lives when you're just shocked by the number of people who take the time and the effort to join together and demonstrate whatever, you know. So
Very good.
well,
Susan,
you know, I think we're more, I think we're more impervious sort of to it.
but in size, the women's parade in 2013 or 1913 was longer, actually amazingly bigger than the one in 2017, wasn't it?
I can't swear to it.
Okay.
Somebody else maybe. Judy might know.
Okay. We have could you spell out the website of your organization, the Friends of Amoru?
It's AMORU, Amoru. And we came up, I think, with a very good motto for the school, and it's "Upon this rock, build your future."
But what's the email address for the to donate?
Oh, just friendsofamoru.org.
Oh, very good. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
You can
Mike?
Google that too, I think.
Mike, you do have a question in the Q&A.
Okay. You know, I don't show one. Adam, do you show one?
Yeah, in the chat. So Mary Ellen is asking if you could restate what was the key to success for women overcoming all the obstacles that you listed to finally succeed in getting the right to vote.
Well, I think there's several stages to, you know, what they did. Certainly after the war, they got active. And I think that's based a lot on, when you had more educated women, you had women who'd done all these amazing things during the war. And then, of course, you have to jump over the hurdle of, you know, of the leaders passing on, and were we going to have a group that could continue, grab the baton and run with it without sort of losing ground. And I think that's what those three women, Blatch, Paul, and oh shoot, the name just went out of my head. Anyway, what they accomplished in the early 20th century.
Very
But
Any other questions? I don't see anything else in chat or Q&A. Let me mention, we were talking about minorities, if I may speak for a moment, not having the right to vote for so long. In addition to African Americans, the Native Americans couldn't vote until they were given citizenship in 1924, and because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 19teens, they couldn't vote until the 1920s. But there are two new books out, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. And then there's a book coming out shortly called Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. I think many of you would be interested in. Any other questions? If not, Susan and everyone else, thank you so much. What a wonderful evening. And look forward to you joining us in October. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.